Hi, everyone. Following our introduction to classical theory and getting into our first theorist, Marx and Engels, today what we're going to do for our class is get into the first classical theory reading. So we don't consider Machiavelli to be a classical theorist because when he was writing, he wasn't really kind of in conversation with other writers. So here you start to see, the beginning of the 19th century, kind of the formalization of higher education. So colleges are coming onto the scene, and within colleges, you start to have people writing kind of back and forth with one another, and the creation of a formalized area of social theory. So here we start to see our first classical theory piece, the Communist Manifesto. But before we get into that, just to kind of remind ourselves what we did last class, with this introduction, we saw that in the 19th century, the major social changes that were going on were shaping the theories that were being created. So, for example, the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of capitalism, new technologies, all these things that were going on, what we call in their totality, the emergence of modernity. It's what really the authors are getting at in terms of what they're trying to look at and what they're trying to theorize. So a lot of this stuff, we take for granted, the technologies, the capitalism, but for Marx and Engels, for Durkheim, for Weber, these were new things going on. And so they wanted to recognize, what are some of the consequences of these new things. So those individuals I just named, Marx and Engels, Durkheim, and Weber, are the big three of classical theory. And those are the three authors that we're going to be looking at throughout the next couple of weeks. And so Marx and Engels really focus on the emergence of a new mode of production, a new way to organize society, to create what people need to live. And because capitalism is that new mode of production, that's their primary focus in their research. So getting into the Communist Manifesto, if you look at this image here we have on our slide, you start to see people coming together. We can imagine, again, seeing it through the Marxist lens, we can see workers organizing, workers coming together, and as a result of that organization, social change can be promoted. So that idea is at the heart of the Communist Manifesto. So getting into the general theme of the Communist Manifesto, we can say that it's a theory of social change. And so, like the Prince, I actually read the Communist Manifesto in a Western Civ class when I was an undergraduate. And when I was assigned the book, basically, the teacher didn't give us any type of context. And so I read through it expecting some type of manifesto on communism. And basically that's not there. He barely mentions communism at all in the entire book. Just a few sentences, basically, that's it. And so it's not a manifesto of communism. The book as written is a theory of social change. So that's the type of theory we're looking at. And as a theory of social change, specifically, he's trying to explain, Marx and Engels, they are trying to explain the evolution of society, how society moves forward, societal progress. So that's what we need to kind of understand to really get out of the book, get out of the reading what we need to get out of it. A theory of change, specifically looking at societal progress and how societal progress occurs. And so when looking at the how, we can start to unpack, how society progresses, how society moves forward. And so for Marx and Engels, again, their focus is on the mode of production in the society. And now we have capitalism and modernity. So that's their main focus, how capitalism as that mode of production is kind of driving social life forward, perhaps in new ways compared to the past. So to understand, according to Marx and Engels, how society moves forward, how it evolves, we need to recognize the mode of production in a society. Again, a mode of production is simply how you organize society to create what you need to live, the food you need, the shelter you need, the clothing, the protection, how do you get all these things you need to survive? And so previous modes of production, we can say, were slavery, a mode of production in which you had kind of the free people and the slaves doing most of the work in terms of creating those goods that are needed, producing the food that's needed. And then in a later kind of mode of production, you had feudalism, in which you had the lords kind of controlling the serfs. And then in capitalism, you have the kind of owner, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie, they're the capitalist class. They're the owners because they own the means of production. The proletariat symbolizes the worker, and the worker because they don't own the means of production. They don't own the factory, they don't own the land the factory's on, they don't own the equipment in the factory. They're forced to sell their labor to the capitalist. And so that's, those modes of production, how you organize society to get what you need to get. And based upon the mode of production, you have social struggle. So each mode of production you have shapes the struggle within that society. In a slave system, the struggles between, the free people and the slave. In feudalism, the struggles between the lord and the serf. Now in capitalism, the struggle is between the capitalist class, the owners, and the workers. So this struggle, between the, two different groups, the oppressor and the oppressed, this is what really starts to move society forward. And in society, you start to see that the modes of production will evolve because, one of the two groups basically is winning. And kind of with their victory, you start to get kind of a new mode of production. And so, again, if you go back to our last lecture, Hegel thought it was all about kind of new ideas, new ways of thinking. And so, the slave owners became nice people all of a sudden. So they became lords and gave serfs a little bit more freedom and autonomy. And then, the lords eventually became nicer people, and it became a capitalist, giving the serfs a new social status of wage workers. And with that new status in a new capitalist society, you have more freedom and more equality. Marx and Engels don't believe that. They believe basically it's a struggle that ultimately produces a new mode of production. So we have, the emergence of modernity, new globalization, new technology, new industry. And basically it was a platform on which, the lords could have more control, over what is being produced. They can have more control over goods when they could, go to different countries around the world, go to different spaces and acquire goods that are needed rather than relying on serfs to produce the goods for them. They can employ, wage workers and only care for them, when they're working, and when they're not producing, when they're not working, they don't really care about them. So you have the new technology, you have the ability to travel new parts of the world and acquire things. And, with these new abilities, with these new realities, you can create a new system that gives you more power, as a capitalist person compared to a lord. And so this is what you start to see with the new technology. You don't need a bunch of serfs to work the land anymore. You have, these plows, you have a cotton gin, later you have tractors. So it just makes more sense to hire workers on an hourly basis and pay them low wages than to care for, hundreds of serfs, 365 days a year. But without the technology, without these new material forces, none of this would be possible. So the new material forces kind of drive the change. And, with this change, you're going to get a new form of struggle. So now in the Communist Manifesto, we're looking at the new struggle between the worker and the owner, and how this struggle based upon the new mode of production is going to drive society forward even more. So capitalism, according to Marx and Engels, simplifies class forms. So basically, you're going to start to, get rid of the middle. And with this, you have the capitalist, and then you have the workers kind of against one another. They do recognize in capitalism a middle class. And this middle class represents kind of smaller owners. So I like to say owners with a lowercase c, so small shop owners. So you own like a local tool shop rather than you own a Home Depot or Lowe's. So, middle class does exist, these smaller kind of owners, but over time, the capitalist system, how it works, basically it's going to, wipe out, basically it's going to minimize this middle class. So what happens to the local music stores? What happens to the local tool stores when the Lowe's comes to town, or when Amazon goes online? Basically you can't compete, as a small time capitalist, small time owner, with the large corporations. As a result, you're going to kind of have to shut down your business. You lose your business, and you become kind of part of the working class, according to Marx and Engels. So we kind of recognize how this happens. The owners and the workers become kind of simplified, kind of put against one another, and workers within this new system become double slaves, according to Marx and Engels. One angle of the enslavement is basically you're enslaved to the capitalists because they're the ones that provide you the wages with which you create and sustain a livelihood. So without those wages to pay rent, to purchase food, to take care of family members, you can't basically have your life. So you're kind of enslaved to the capitalists because they're the ones providing you the wages. And the second form of enslavement is now also you're enslaved to technology. So in the past, if you were a serf, for example, or if you were a slave, you were controlled by the, slave owner, or controlled by the lord. But the technology you used when you did your working, you were in control of. So, if you're planting, you basically are using your hands. If you're, creating things, perhaps you're using like a saw and a hammer, but you control the saw and the hammer. It doesn't control you. So you can put the hammer down. You can go at the speed that you want. So now in this kind of new kind of historical period, we have new forms of technology that begins to control the workers. So, you step on the assembly line and you don't control the speed of work. You can't stop and start the work because the machine is controlling you. And so here's kind of that second form of enslavement, where not only are you kind of enslaved to the capitalists because they pay your wages, but also you're enslaved to the technology, because unlike in the past where you controlled the technology, the hammer and the nail, now the larger technology controls you. You don't control the speed. You don't control when you start, when you stop. The technology controls you. And so kind of, with this, you start to see an unrest begin. And Marx says it kind of starts on the individual level first. You start to recognize that you're working hard, you're working long hours. During this time period, work conditions were very unsafe, very dangerous and dirty. This is before, workers fought and, won, different policies for, workplace environments, workplace safety measures. So, the safety measures we have today, weren't going on back then. So, work was tough, it was dangerous. And, you're putting in kind of all the effort and you're getting, relatively speaking, little in return. So, the boss, the capitalist, they're basically, living the good life, and you're risking your life, on a daily basis, and just to kind of get by. So this personal unrest, starts to turn into a more social unrest, where, coworkers begin to talk to one another. Hey, have you ever thought about how we're kind of getting ripped off here? We're putting in all the work, but even though we put in all the work, we're getting, relatively speaking, we get little in return. And then, basically start to get an organization at the factory, at the plant, and then workers will unite. And it's only through their organization that workers have any power against a capitalist. So if only one worker is unhappy and says, I want safer work conditions, or, I want a weekend, or, I want higher wages. It's easy just to fire and replace one worker. But if you have an entire factory, an entire plant that says, we want this, it's hard to fire, over, 100 people and replace them automatically. That's going to take a lot of time. And with the time you waste, you're wasting money as well. And what you start to see is the organization that goes beyond one specific factory. So let's say that you make automobiles, you talk to other automobile makers, workers, and you start to say, hey, we're all in the same boat here. We may work in different places, but we're all kind of in the same boat. So you start to get trade unions for everybody who does the same trade, organizes. And the more numbers you have, the more strength you have in terms of withholding your labor. And again, withholding your labor is the only kind of power you have in relationship to the capitalist. And so not only do you start to see trade unions, you start to get kind of larger worker unions in general. It doesn't matter if I make a washing machine or if I make a car, I'm still a worker. And so all workers begin to unite. And this organization, slowly but surely, turns into a revolution, turns into social evolution, where you start to get more kind of socialist principles emerging, such as a minimum wage, such as minimum safety work conditions, such as overtime pay, weekends, Social Security. So these are all kind of socialist programs and principles that exist today. And this is what Marx and Engels were predicting. We only get these kind of socialist programs because workers fought for them and workers won them. And so that's what's going on, and that's how society moves forward. And Marx ultimately believes that capitalist systems will shift more and more towards socialist systems, and with that you get a new mode of production. And under a socialist system, you get more freedom, you get more equality amongst individuals. So the driving force, kind of why this is, basically, again, is that mode of production that's putting everything in motion. The new mode of production of capitalism creates that new social struggle between the worker and the owner. The workers see their exploitation and they organize as a result. And based upon that organization, society begins to move forward with little by little kind of socialist programs, socialist dimensions emerging within a new mode of production. And again, with that, more equality, more freedom. And so we can see relevance of this today, protesting, firing activists, So here, specifically going back to a Black Friday, where Walmart workers were going to protest. They weren't going to work on Black Friday, and they were doing this all to get more wages, And a lot of cities are coming together to specifically promote a higher minimum wage. And so again, if it's only one person who's saying, I wish the minimum wage was higher, that's not going to do anything. But if all workers kind of organize together and threat to or actually do withhold their labor, that's the power they have. Because once the work stops, so does the production. And when the production stops, that's going to ultimately kind of hurt profit margins. And so another place we can see relevance is you start to see college athletes talking about actually doing similar types of organization. So starting unions in terms of playing football or playing basketball in college, because the NCAA as an institution, makes millions of dollars, and all the money doesn't get trickled down to people actually doing the work. But if it's one athlete who's upset about feeling like you're not getting your fair share, and then that's not going to have any power, nothing's going to happen. But if an entire team says we're not going to play, if an entire a sport comes together and says we're not going to play, then the people are going to start to listen to you, because there are, again, $1 million at stakes if you don't get on the field, if you don't get on the court. It's only through that organization that you start to have power. But finally, you can start to see another relevance here in terms of income inequality. So if you look at this chart, basically it's showing us, um, since the late 1960s up to 2012, how inequality has increased. So basically, if you go back to the late 60s, you do have different classes, which will be part of a capitalist system, but there was, less income inequality then. And so, the rich were richer, but the middle class was getting a little bit larger piece of the pie. And what you start to see is, since basically the early 1970s, the inequality has emerged. The rich are getting richer and the middle class is shrinking. The middle class is getting less. And what's going on here at the same time, the amount of union participation is decreasing. So those who actually are in a union, unions that actually exist, have decreased during the same time period. And Marx and Engels would say that this is what happens. When unions start to shrink, workers will start to lose power. And when workers start to lose power, then we start to see the inequality growing rather than the inequality shrinking. A smaller amount of inequality comes with high union participation. When you have lower participation in unions, you start to get higher amounts of inequality as a result. So I'll leave that there for today. In our next class, we'll stay with Marx and Engels and look at a few more different theories that they have. And we'll see different types of theories. We'll see a theory of social control with the German ideology. We'll look at a theory of exploitation with commodity fetishism. And we'll look at a theory of human experience when we look at machinery technology. So we'll leave that there for today. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these readings, especially at the beginning of the semester, will be abstract, will be a little bit difficult. So always make sure that you can reach out to me during our live sessions, reach out to me during office hours if you have any questions or you feel like you need any help.